Welcome to the All Things Bright and Beautiful podcast. I'm Jenna DePrima here with my co-host Lydia Shively, and this is a discussion of life, books, and theology from a confessionally reformed Christian perspective. Welcome back to All Things Bright and Beautiful. I am Jenna DePrima here with my co-host Lydia Shively. Lydia, how are you doing today?
Good. It's good to be back.
I know. So we are going to be discussing Remaking the World, how 1776 created the post-Christian West by Andrew Wilson. It was published in 2023 by Crossway, so it's a new book.
Yeah.
So this book I found it to be a very interesting and kind of a unique book in some ways. Mm-hmm. It's history, but it's also cultural analysis, and it kind of combines a lot of different, not genres, but just a lot of different things.
Yeah, it's a lot of like touch points that I wouldn't have put together, but seeing them all come together, it's like, it makes sense.
It makes sense, yeah. And I do think this book is in some ways a good one to read after reading Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, or we actually discussed on the podcast Strange New World, which is an abbreviated version of that. I think if you had to choose between that or this, I would choose Trueman's book.
Same, yeah.
But I do think this book is different. It's kind of, there's definitely some similar themes, and I would say it's kind of an interesting follow-up. So it's sort of in that same vein if you liked Trueman's book.
Yeah, there's definitely there's a lot of like similar names that you'll see. Mm-hmm. I think he even quotes Trueman at one point.
Yeah, and he talks about expressive individualism too, which we'll probably get into later, which is a big theme in Trueman's book.
I do think it's easier to read in a lot of ways because he introduces a lot of people in history, but he gives you a framework for who they are, whereas I feel like in Trueman's book, there's a lot more of like, wait, who's that?
That's true.
It's a little harder to follow unless you knew who those people were. Less so in Strange New World. That one was easier for sure. But I feel like this one it touches on a lot of those people, but you're introduced in a way that's not overwhelming, I think.
Yeah, that's very true. I definitely agree. And there's a lot of, I guess Trueman's book had a lot of footnotes too, but there's a lot of footnotes in this book as well, which I think are helpful and kind of shed light on things that may otherwise be confusing. But yeah, the basic thesis of the book is that he says in the beginning, the big idea of this book is that 1776, more than any other year in this last millennium, is the year that made us who we are. And he gives examples of the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, romanticism, kind of all of the things that happened kind of pre-1776 and then into 1776 and then kind of also, I guess, post-1776 as well. But he talks about really when you think of 1776, you think of the founding of America, which is certainly a big part of what he's talking about. But interestingly, I would say he kind of in some ways talks about Europe.
Probably more,
than that. I mean, he certainly does talk about the importance of the American Revolution, but it's not like it's all about that,
Right. Well, and so much of his thesis is all of these pieces had to be in place for America to be founded the way that it was founded, as this like Enlightenment, educated, religious, democratic community, like all these things that he talks about were kind of like a necessary component that then made the culture that we now experience in America and most of the West.
Right.
Yeah.
And he also uses a concept kind of throughout the book. He uses the term weirder, and he talks about how that he has a word for each of, that's an acronym. He has a word for each of those letters, and each letter stands for, the first letter stands for Western, and then it's educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, ex-Christian, and romantic. Mm-hmm. So he talks about kind of throughout the book how those 7 features have made us who we are today. And he goes into each of those words essentially has like a chapter kind of that he goes into how those things made us who we are today. And so then he also makes the claim that the 7 of those things all are true because of the events that happened in 1776.
Right. Yeah, it was really interesting, all of the like touch points he gives of 1776. I'm going to struggle through saying that. Because in how we do home education, we do, it's called a book of centuries. Mm-hmm. And you basically have like a 2-page spread for every century. Mm-hmm. And as you're like reading history and all these different things, you enter in people or events or wars, all of that you enter in as you go. And then you kind of get this visual it's like almost a simplified timeline or a like truncated way of looking at a timeline, maybe. But I felt like this whole book was like a book of centuries on 1776, which was cool to see because it's helpful to see how a lot of different things are happening that you wouldn't necessarily relate to each other. But then when you kind of see them all together, you can see how the interrelations between them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoyed I think it's the beginning of the second chapter, he goes into, starts with the argument that you live in a weirder world, and he goes into all of these different ways that is true of us. Like he makes basically, I think he says over 100 generalizations about you. So he talks about, like, first of all, you're reading this book, like you can read, and probably everyone in your family can read. You're sitting in a house that has a clock, probably numerous clocks, and you have electricity, and you have, and he makes all these different things that are like, yeah, we all have that, you know. And then he says, like, all of these things that I've said would not have been true of you, I forget how many years ago he says.
Yeah,
but
it is really interesting because he also points out, like, the shortness of time. Like, 1776 wasn't that long ago. And then he makes kind of the case of why it's important to know this history, like how important it is for us to be connected to our history, the sort of pitfalls of forgetting, which I feel like we talked about that before when we talked about other books.
Yeah.
But just the what we are sort of prone to when we have sort of cultural historical amnesia. And he makes some really good points on that as he kind of builds. He talks about how we're sort of building our narrative and how important that is. And I would say he's kind of making his case for the narrative of the West post 1776.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that as well, and kind of that term he uses of historical amnesia. And it made me think of, I think we discussed this C.S. Lewis quote on, I can't remember which episode now, but there's a well-known C.S. Lewis quote about chronological snobbery.
Yeah, I think that was our first episode.
Maybe,
when we were talking about reading old books, maybe.
That may have been, but the idea that, we always assume in the modern world that we kind of know best and have all the best knowledge and all of that, and because we don't read books from the past, and because we're not aware of things that have happened in history, we're prideful, kind of, essentially. I mean, it's worded much better. Maybe we can quote it in the notes. But and Andrew Wilson says a similar thing. He says, memory should generate humility, the acknowledgement of our past with all its strengths and weaknesses, and the recognition that the reason we have the moral convictions we do and the material advances we do is because of our ancestors. As James Baldwin relentlessly points out, we are our history. And so he's kind of making the case for why a book like this is relevant. Like, we need to understand the cultural influences and the history that have led us to where we are today. And that should hopefully produce humility in us and help us to understand kind of where we've been and how we've gotten here.
That's funny because, like, he talks about the Enlightenment quite a bit, and that even that attitude is, like, birthed a lot from the Enlightenment of, like, we've progressed so far forward, we know so much better than those before us. But as he points out in that chapter, like, we only know what we know because of what people before us learned and put down that we now have been able to, like, pick up.
Right. Yeah. Very true. Yeah. So Andrew Wilson quotes a Welsh pastor named Richard Price, who said, "Next to the introduction of Christianity among mankind, the American Revolution may prove the most important step in the progressive course of human improvement." And I think this is an interesting quote because obviously it first of all emphasizes the importance of Christianity among mankind and amongst the culture. But secondly, the importance of the American Revolution. And Wilson goes on to kind of explain that quote in further detail. And he talks about the effect that democracy has had on not only America, but on really all nations in the world. And he quotes Alexander Hamilton, who said that real liberty is neither found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy, but in moderate governments. And he just talks a lot about how this idea of democracy has made really, like, not only influenced our country, but made so many other countries adopt the democratic system and see the validity and the importance in that, when pre-1776, no one
did that.
Did that. There was such a thing did not exist.
We take that so much for granted.
Yeah, it's wild to think about. Like, that completely influences the way that we think about government and the way that a nation should be run. But that was created by, our founding fathers.
Right. And I think that angle of how because in that quote, it's the establishment of America, but also the Christian influence.
Yeah.
There are so many things, and he does a good job of pointing this out. There are so many things that we don't recognize as being Christian ideas that are so ingrained because they've been divorced from Christianity. So people have adopted these things that can only come from Christianity. And he talks about how that's like cognitive dissonance, which we can talk about more.
Yeah.
But there are so many things that we just take for granted that we have and we consider just like rights or like they're just assumed, and we have those because of the Christian influence in our nation and in the West,
right.
and in the world too. I mean, it's spread much broader than that, I think too.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right.
So he talks about that. I think it's kind of like near the end of the book, more so. Although I feel like that idea is kind of like sprinkled throughout, because I don't think we mentioned, but Andrew Wilson is a pastor in London.
And he's
So he's writing this from a Christian perspective, and definitely gives that framework. Like it's not like it's in the background. Like he gives that framework. He frames it beginning and end. But there's another book that digs even deeper into the idea. It's called The Air We Breathe, and I can't remember the author. We'll link it, but it's that same idea. Like there are so many things. It's so normal for us to think of helping the vulnerable, people being equal in value. Like that idea is so normal to us. It's like breathing air, but we don't recognize that has just not always been the reality. And not even like for that long. Like it's not that long since those ideas have become normal.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And Wilson talks about how in the late 18th century, concepts like right, consent, choice, equality were kind of just coming about and being used to form a government. And but he makes argument that their influence quickly spread beyond that. And by the 20th century, they're issues of morality now. Like we view it as like it is a moral thing for people to be equal.
Right.
And it is immoral for them to be unequal. Or it is, and that just was not at all the case, 300 plus years ago.
Right.
So another thing that he says in the book is that we used to look at humanity through theological lenses, and now we look at theology through human lenses. So he's kind of talking, I guess he's showing how we've become kind of this post-Christian nation and how we view things so differently now, how much the Enlightenment and things like that have affected our view of humanity and theology, and how things are not viewed through kind of this theological lens, I guess, anymore. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, kind of to that same point of we have a lot of these ideas that we now see as like moral imperatives.
Right.
Helping the least of these, helping the oppressed.
Yeah.
The idea of equality. But these ideas have been divorced from God. So it's not, we do these because we obey the one true God. We do these things because this is what's good for humanity. And so that whole lens has shifted. The idea is that, like, it's so crazy because those ideas have there's no foundation underneath those. You can't make an argument without God for why those things are important, but people do it nonetheless. And so that whole lens has shifted for, like, the question why isn't really a question for most people anymore. And a lot of more people are comfortable with not having an answer to that and just sort of adopting those good things, but not having a God to submit to in it. And of course, like redefining it too, right? Like there's a large redefinition of some of these ideas too, because we talk about equality of persons, but that doesn't include the unborn. And, so that there's all, it's very much mixed up. But even just the existence of those things, like you said, 300 years ago, that was not the norm. But now we have people have co-opted that, and that lens has it's become man-centered. The angle that it's directed is towards people instead of towards God. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And even, I mean, I think thinking about the influence of Immanuel Kant, who came a little bit, I mean, he wrote, so Wilson quotes it from an essay that he wrote in 1784. So he was, kind of in this time period, but a little bit post 1776. And Kant, made the argument that you should kind of move from this immaturity, which he defines as the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. So move from that immaturity to your own understanding. And so he says the motto of the Enlightenment is have courage to use your own understanding. And so he's trying to make this argument for the basis of knowledge and understanding, as you've kind of pointed out, apart from God, which which you can't really do. But that's where I think a lot of the basis of where we are today comes from, is from some of the, these arguments that he was making, and from these ideas that came about.
Yeah, and he talked, there's a couple quotes that I wanted to bring up on that, because I thought that part was especially good. Just pointing out, like, if you have any interaction with like philosophers, everyone is just like, Kant is so great. And sure, there's a lot that we learned from Kant, but a lot of what we learned from Kant is like a lot of the things that we wouldn't value as Christians, because it's so much of it is that skepticism and that self, like, he wouldn't say follow your heart, but it is kind of that. It's like that self, like my inner reason trumps anything outside of me. Yeah, like you said, that we should have the courage to think for ourselves. But one of the things he quotes Kant, kind of on that same idea, I won't read the whole quote, but he quotes Kant's sort of assertion of that, of you should have the courage to think for yourselves. Thinking not like you should think for yourself, like don't just follow what everyone else thinks, but more like you should be able to come up with ideas apart from anything, just totally on your own. Yeah. And then the way Wilson responds is, it is ironic to champion the importance of thinking for yourself, free from the guidance of anyone else, by quoting the guidance of someone else, because Kant does that all the time, where he's quoting other people in order to say, but you don't need anyone to guide you, except that Kant is the one guiding us. You're following Kant's advice by...
And he's clearly standing on the backs of other people that he's quoting. Yeah, another thing I found to be fascinating that I was not aware of, maybe some listening to this are more knowledgeable than I am, but I did not know that. So Wilson talks about how Jefferson sent the Declaration of Independence to Benjamin Franklin to make kind of some final edits. And so originally Jefferson had written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Franklin crossed out those last three words, sacred and undeniable, and changed it to self-evident, and which is, obviously now such a famous line. Right. We hold these truths to be self-evident. But that, even in that, what kind of seems like a minor edit, that it actually had huge implications, and that Franklin was taking out the kind of the theological basis for the argument that he's making. Like Jefferson, even though Jefferson was not, by all accounts, was not a Christian, as much as we can tell, he was still sort of basing his argument in theology and religion. Like he was saying that these truths are undeniable and that they're sacred because they originate with a creator, essentially is the implication of that statement. Whereas Franklin is grounding these truths in reason and saying they are just, self-evident. And so I just found that fascinating. And we recognize, like, as Christians, we would say, well, no, actually those truths are not self-evident. Like, they are only evident because they've been given to us by a creator.
Yeah. Well, and I think even a historian can't say that. Like Wilson points this out too. He says there are plenty of cultures in which it is not remotely self-evident to people that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, let alone that these rights include life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the prerogative to abolish any government that does not preserve them. Like that's not self-evident, because there's hardly anyone else has come to that conclusion. Especially before this.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, and Wilson goes on to say that Franklin's brief correction is a marvelous metaphor for the ex-Christian West. That he's attempting to basically essentially retain Christianity's moral conclusions while getting rid of its theological foundations.
Which I think we see that now in just like such clear contrast.
Yeah, there's just so many more things now that are viewed as immoral. Murder is immoral, but why? If you're not a Christian, why is it? And I think there's not really, I think when you actually get down to it with people, that they don't have a good answer for that, apart from a theological basis.
Yeah.
So another thing that he talks about is the effect of the Industrial Revolution, and that's in that kind of weirder framework, one of the letters stands for industrialized, and this stood out to me perhaps just because we discussed this on a previous episode, but he brings up the example of what was originally called the modern Prometheus, which was renamed to Frankenstein. So we'll link the link to the episode where we discussed Frankenstein. But he just talks about how it's really the novel Frankenstein is a parable for the dangers of industrial knowledge. And I mean, you probably know the story of Frankenstein. If you don't, go back and listen to that episode. But basically the student in Frankenstein who, does this experiment to try to create new life, and his experiment backfires terribly on him, and all of this terrible horror and destruction and all of these things happen as a result of Frankenstein, who I'm sorry, his name is Frankenstein, actually, which
the monster doesn't have a name.
The monster does not have a name. So, all of these things happen after he creates this monster, and so. Eventually Frankenstein comes to understand kind of the responsibility that he as a creator has to his creature, but it's too late at that point. But the novel leaves you wrestling with, the benefits versus the danger of technology, and kind of the idea of this monster being created that we cannot control. And it really is a parable of in some ways the Industrial Revolution, but also it's certainly applicable today as well, and applicable to kind of our modern tendency to rely so heavily on the technology that we have today to our own detriment. I think in a lot of ways, like, we can see, like, we have kind of created a monster that's out of control. And I don't mean that to say, like, all technology is bad.
No, I don't think that Mary Shelley would have been arguing that either.
Yeah.
So
but
much
there's a tension.
Yeah,
there,
there's a tension there, and so much of, like, undergirding what Frankenstein does is this hubris. It's this human. And and even her use of Prometheus, which I try not to talk about this too much because I think I talked about it ad nauseum probably in our other episode. But I just think it's so interesting because she was so brilliant to even title it that, because Prometheus steals fire from the gods, and it's this attitude of we should be able as humans to defy the gods.
Yeah.
And I think if you're thinking in our modern technology, our modern medical advances, we constantly do things because we can, and so, like, way down the line we suddenly ask, oh, should we have done this? Instead of starting with, should we do this? Just because we can does not mean that we should.
Right.
And he even mentions, at the end of kind of that chapter on the Industrial Revolution, he said that kind of the just advancement of technology and all of that, machinery, everything. He says it can either be, some people see it that it's a curse that only looks like a blessing, like Pandora's box or Turkish delight, or maybe that it's proof of divine judgment, or perhaps both. But even mentioning Pandora, the outcome of Prometheus giving the humans fire is that God send Pandora, and she opens this box and releases all ills on human beings. So just that, I think this idea that there is always this tension of advancement brings its own woes. I mean, even ancients who were not Christians had a recognition of this. And then if we add that element of that hubris of, we should be thinking not, should we do this, or can we do this, but should we do this? Is this honoring to God? Is this how he would want us to use the gifts he's given us? Yeah,
and I think that's also one of the benefits of understanding history and studying history, is that we see where we've come from, and the dangers that maybe lie in kind of what's happened in the past and what could happen in the future, and hopefully it helps us to approach our current cultural moment with a bit more humility and perspective, and to not just view things through only like a modern lens.
Right. And to think that everything, because I think he does a good job of kind of pointing this out, like, we have all these things as a result of kind of 1776 and all that happened around that, with all, like, Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, democracy, the exploration of the world and sort of globalization. We have all these things, and we almost always think of them as pure advantage. There's no downside to it. That's kind of the modern way of thinking, because we've progressed, and so it can only be good. Yeah. As opposed to, I think he helps us even just take a step back and think, well, is everything good that's come out of this, or should we maybe be, like, thinking through the different aspects of this, and not that we need to go back to the 1700s or before, but thinking through where we are and what things about it that maybe we've taken for granted we should avoid, or, like, think a little bit more carefully about.
Right. The R in that weirder acronym stands for romantic, and I found this fascinating. I didn't really know this. He has a whole, I think, very interesting chapter on how we're influenced by the romantics and by romanticism. But one person that he talks about is Casanova, who I don't know that I knew really anything about.
He's so icky.
And yeah, it's funny because I think my tendency is to think of Casanova kind of in a positive light because, the term like, oh, you're such a Casanova.
Right.
Our culture has sort of a positive way of talking or using that term. But yeah, actually Casanova wrote about like all of his like sexual exploits and, all of these things. And
he was super gross.
Yeah, right. And like I guess, so Wilson says what was interesting about his writing, I mean, there were certainly other books that talked about sex or that had, sexual scenes in them, but that Casanova wrote about sex as a means of explaining and defining himself. Mm-hmm. And so he talks about how he's an example of the culture moving towards this self-definition that's tied up in sexuality. You know, that our sexuality is kind of now what defines us, and that having an inward understanding of our sexuality, of our own sexuality is paramount,
it's like who we are.
And that wouldn't have been, and I think it's so natural to us now to think that way that we can't imagine thinking another way, but that historically thinking about your sexuality wouldn't have been something you would use to define yourself.
Right. There certainly wouldn't be like the length of writing about it in such a way, and people wanting to know to the degree that he sort of set that standard. It is interesting. I read Rumi's poetry not that long ago because I was like, oh, this is like a foundation of poetry. And most of his poetry is kind of about sexuality. He's like an ancient Persian poet. Mm-hmm. And I would say a lot of like Eastern paganism has that same focus, which is really interesting. So when he did say like no one else had done this, part of me was like, well,
yeah, that's probably too
I don't know if
strong
that's kind of an overstatement. Yeah. But maybe as I thought about it more, I was like, well, I feel like in a lot of like Eastern paganism, sexuality, I mean, you have that like, there's all sorts of things, but there is this like picture of sexuality being like crucial to religion in a lot of Eastern paganism. Mm-hmm. But I feel like Casanova and like combined with the Enlightenment, it's like this new breed of paganism because it's about the individual even more so.
Right.
So in that way, I do think it's like Casanova and the others that he kind of talks about. It's kind of like a new flavor of old paganism, which I think like makes a lot of sense because that's kind of what we do. We sort of remake old idols.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a quote in that same chapter by Goethe or Goth, I don't know.
I think it's actually Goethe, which is super pretentious sounding to say it right.
I have no idea. I not know how his name is.
It looks like Goethe, so I think you can say it that way.
So he asserted that art was only genuine if its influence arises from deep, harmonious, independent feeling, from feeling peculiar to itself. This was interesting to me too. Wilson just kind of talks about this whole group of German artists.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Had this really that kind of birthed the romantic movement in some ways that I like didn't know anything about. So I won't go into all that. You'll have to read the book if you're interested in that. But I think that quote is such a fascinating one that now even art is kind of moving towards this. Like it has to be it's only genuine or beautiful if it's kind of coming from this feeling within or this self-expression. Yeah.
It's not it's a whole different angle because instead of art being sort of a communication from artists to people viewing the art,
right,
it's entirely about the single person, like that one person who's making it.
And you think about, I mean, so much of art maybe 1600s, 1700s is religious art.
Right? Yeah.
And there was kind of an objective standard of what is beautiful, and I'm not saying like all art has to be quote unquote religious, but there was a standard for beauty and for true what is true, and the artists were trying to reflect in a beautiful way these truths, and that's has changed so drastically to what art is today, or what it has been the last several hundred years when you look at modern art.
I was just reading an article about some guy that composes in silence. Like
What?
the silence is what he composes, and I was like, it's not actually music, but that's like he's like a world famous composer, and like
that, like there's no
sound. Yes. It's as absurd as it sounds. I don't remember his name, but it's just like are we calling that art? But I think when you unmoor beauty from truth, and you say these things are not actual. They don't exist as standalone realities, and we just define them, then that is like we've come to the logical conclusion of that, and we should look at that and be like, that's ridiculous. But if we adopt this mentality, you can't say that.
Yeah, and I think it's, like when you walk into a modern art museum, I'm not saying all modern art is this way, but you'll see. I'm trying to think of an example, but you'll see, like an artist that's like, I don't know, dismembered a baby doll and put it on a canvas, just things like that.
Or like the famous one where it's like a banana just taped to a canvas.
Yeah, and that is art, supposedly.
Yes.
And I think, it's because it's like, that's what we get when we remove, when we no longer have any kind of basis for what is beautiful or what is true or what is good.
Yep.
So the book also brings up Rousseau in this chapter on romanticism and his influence on so much of where we've gotten to today, Wilson quotes Robert, I don't know how to say his last name, Bella, I think, who kind of calls the way that we define selfhood today as expressive individualism, and this idea is also in Truman's books. But basically, expressive individualism is the idea that at the heart of each person is this unique emotional core that needs to find expression for our individuality to be realized. So kind of who we are at our emotional core is what matters, and that we all deserve to be able to like uniquely express our individualism, and that's so much of how we view the self today. And then he also quotes Philip Reif, which I believe Truman also, I want to say,
so.
quotes.
Yeah.
Or at least I've heard him quoted on like podcasts and things like that. And Reif talks about or Reif, I'm like probably butchering all of these names. I'm so sorry. I only read a lot of these names.
Yeah,
so
I'm usually the one butchering them. So.
But he talks about the triumph of the triumph of the therapeutic. That is hard to say.
Yeah.
In the Western culture, and how just this idea that the fulfillment of the self is what is like important and what is paramount, and kind of how we've psychologized, I guess, the self, and that has influenced the way we see the world so heavily.
Right. Which ironically makes people more depressed and anxious than it does. Which,
for sure.
That was kind of the book that I'm going to forget it. We did an interview with Alan Noble about his book.
On You Are Not Your Own.
You Are Not Your Own, yeah. Of how actually, imagine we were designed to actually have our belonging and identity defined outside of ourselves, not from within. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he quotes, I love this at the end of the chapter, a quote from Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, and in the quote, I won't read the whole quote because it's long, but the author writes, "How do we know what's right for us? Mm-hmm. Every shrink, every career counselor, every Disney princess knows the answer. Be yourself, follow your heart. Only, here's what I really, really want someone to explain to me. What if one happens to be possessed of a heart that can't be trusted?" And then she says a few sentences later, "If your deepest self is singing and coaxing you straight towards the bonfire, is it better to turn away?"
Such a good quote.
And just, what a profound question that our culture is constantly telling us that what the Disney princesses say, follow your heart, be yourself. And, but what if the heart can't be trusted, which as Christians, we certainly know, I mean,
it can't be
trusted.
Right.
I mean, God's word tells us that the heart is deceitful and wicked. And so we have an answer for that.
Right. Yeah. Which I really appreciated, like that part. And like in his conclusion, he talks about, the musical Hamilton and Eliza Hamilton's, like, I've never seen it, but there's like a song at the end, I guess, that Eliza Hamilton sings, or maybe she says it, I don't know. She sings it. I guess everything is singing. It's a musical, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's some talking, but if you're, I think it's singing.
But she says, like, is this enough? She's done all these things, and then she asks kind of twice, I think, is this enough? Have I done enough? Mm-hmm. And I think both of those questions, a lot of people, maybe they're not saying it, but are perhaps feeling it. And like evangelistically, there is an answer only Christianity can give to those things that people who think that, oh, I can find the answers within myself. I can find my identity within myself. I can work with all these good things that I'm not sure why they're good, and I don't want someone else to define them for me, but I'm going to call them good, and I'm going to work my whole life. That there's still, I think, we can ask those questions kind of towards people and help them see like there is an answer to those things outside of you.
Yep. Yeah, and that's a good segue to towards the end of the book. He talks for a while about John Newton, and Newton, as you may know, wrote the famous hymn "Amazing Grace," but he did a lot more than that. I think that's what a lot of people know him for. Right. But he has his letters, I know you read them recently, so you might have a comment on that in a second, but he has letters and so much writing that is so edifying, and his view of grace is so, I think, helpful to us, and I think is such an answer to the question that Eliza Hamilton asked, like, is this enough? Have I done enough with my life? And that ultimately, we know as Christians, no, none of us have done enough.
You never can.
It's only by God's grace that we can, at the end of our lives, know that we are going to be with our Lord. But Newton has a famous quote. He says, "My memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things: that I am a great sinner and that Christ is a great Savior." And he has a wild story. It's definitely worth reading his biography. But he was a slave trader and traded slaves on all these different slave ships and did lots of terrible things, but was eventually converted. And then the Lord just used him in such a profound way to help people understand God's grace and understand his forgiveness.
Yeah.
And he had a big influence on Wilberforce, had a really close relationship with him, who, of course, eventually was a part of ending the slave trade in England. So, but yeah, is there anything, I guess, Lydia, especially in kind of reading his letters recently, that, stands out to you?
That definitely, there's this humility in Newton where he constantly is like aware, even as someone, I mean, he was a pastor in the letters that I read. And there's still this like awareness of, I still am a sinner. I still have seeds of sin within me that I have to repent of daily. And the Lord is constantly sanctifying me. I wish I had some quotes from him because he writes beautifully.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
But there, like you said, his understanding of grace, I think because he has such a deep understanding of his own worthlessness by his own merit, his understanding of the Lord saving me, his grace is so abundant. Yeah. And his ability to then comfort people, because a lot of his letters, it's a ton of just sending letters to people, comforting them in their doubt, in their suffering and afflictions, in their struggles with sin, in their interpersonal relationships, in like the conflicts of even just like disagreements in church and things like that. His ability to comfort people is unparalleled because of his understanding of grace, and it all just pours out of that. Yeah. Which is beautiful, and as Christians, we should take note of that because that's what we can comfort people with. Yeah. Anything less than that is kind of a false comfort. It reminds me of like Jeremiah, where it talks about like your prophets tell you peace, peace, where there's no peace. Yeah. The only way you can give people peace is if they have an understanding of their state as sinners, and that to repent and believe in Christ and to turn to Him, and then there is like peace no matter where you come from. Yeah, definitely. And I think, so Wilson talks about towards the end of the book that we have an opportunity now as Christians, that our vision of freedom is far more genuinely liberating than, he says, its weirder equivalent. So kind of what our modern culture has to offer people, that our view of freedom as Christians is actually much better, and that actually the modern understanding of freedom is actually oppressive, and is actually like all of these just kind of unconstrained choices and the ability to do whatever you want is actually destructive, and you're a slave to your own desires, and that you're a slave to yourself and to what your self wants, or how you define yourself
sexually or emotionally. And so he says genuine liberty is not a matter of freedom from things that might restrict our autonomy, but freedom to choose those things that cause us to flourish and to be who we were originally created to be. So true freedom is no longer being a slave to our sin, but having freedom in Christ. And what I think, positive and wonderful vision for what we can offer the world as Christians, that we can give them the answer to this true vision of freedom that everyone is looking for.
Yeah. He uses which I was kind of surprised. He uses a lot of really interesting allusions in the book, like Hamilton and Goldfinch, even like kind of unexpected sources. But he talks about the Hunger Games and how and he uses the Capitol as an example of that kind of you're actually not free if you're a slave to your passions. Yeah. And which actually her writing on the Capitol is phenomenal. Like when you look at that, you're like, yeah, it's a ridiculous society of people who cannot think deeply enough or master their own passions for anything good. Yeah. And they're miserable.
And if you haven't read the book, I mean, it's the people in the Capitol it's been a long time since I've read it, but they're ridiculous. Like
it's like Hollywood in a lot of ways.
They're like a slave. They're a slave to their own desires, essentially, is kind of the way she depicts them. And so, I think he says in the book, that the kids or the people in the woods that are in the Hunger Games that are being, hunted and killed are actually more free than those other people because they have the autonomy they're able to, make their own choice, and think deeply, and to not just be a slave to their desires.
Right.
And
they have like an ethic of good.
Right.
And a desire to care.
Right. That's right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. That was very interesting to me too. I hadn't really thought about the book that way.
No, and he talks about like the difference between like 1984 versus Brave New World, between those two things, which was just like a fascinating comparison. It's really interesting.
That is. So in conclusion, he raises the question, so what does this mean for the church, essentially? Does this mean that we should make some kind of radical change and try to radically change the culture, or does this mean we should have kind of a renewed commitment to the doctrines and the practices that have defined the church in the past? And Wilson makes the argument that when you read people who have thought seriously about history and about cultural forces and all of those things, that he says you recognize like that fidelity scores higher than novelty, that a loss of influence is not a cause to panic, and that really what the church needs today is the same doctrines and experiences and practices that the church needed in the 18th century and the 10th century and the 2nd century. That ultimately we are not responsible for the fruit of what comes about, but we're responsible for faithfulness. So we're responsible to live as faithful Christians and to be the church in the world, and the Lord is the one that brings about the fruit. And so if it's his will for, there to be something like genuine revival, then that's wonderful, but that's not ultimately up to us, that we need to continue being a people who prays and serves and loves one another and loves our neighbor, and that the Lord, that is the Lord's chosen plan for the kind of the world and for cultural influence.
Yeah, I think we want to try to be like, we need like a movement to fix these problems, but that's never what the Lord calls the church to. He mentions in the very beginning of the book, like Tolkien and T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden as like authors that he really resonates with because of their response to kind of the evil in the world, because they wrote post-World War II. And I feel like the way he kind of bookends the book, so he mentions them at the beginning, and then he says kind of what you were talking about at the very end, that they instruct us because what they do when they see evil in the world is they go back in history and they make their commentary from that, which I think is really helpful. And if you look at like Tolkien, like his books, like The Lord of the Rings, so much of what he gets at is like faithfulness and goodness supersede big movements and like this idea of trying to sort of muscle our way into making things right instead of just trusting God. And it reminded me of, in T.S. Eliot has a collection of poems called The Four Quartets, and in the end, near the end of it, he says, "You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity, or carry report. You are here to kneel." And he gets at, like, we're here to worship God and to obey him. We're not here to try to create ourselves to try to make the next movement that fixes all the problems. We're here to kneel before our God and follow what he instructs us to do. And we trust the outcomes to him. It's not our responsibility to see what's going to happen in 100 years, 200 years. That's not our job.
Amen. Well, I think that's a great note to close on.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like access to more resources, we have a website at allthingspodcast.org. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode.